I was reading a fictional book the other day, and it's like a book with war going on, and there's like 30 point of view characters that you read from, and they're all fighting each other and doing like horrible shit to each other. You know, typical like fantasy book stuff. And the realization hit me as I was reading it that writers are actually fucking insane, bro. They're actually crazy. Like, you'll have books with war and everyone's fighting and arguing, but it's really just one guy. Like, it's just one guy making this all up in his head and just writing it on paper. And obviously that sounds like obvious, right? Of course, that's what writers do. But if you really think about it, that's kind of insane. And so this got me like interested in writers and how they create characters and stuff. So I started like searching up about writing characters, and I came across an interesting study that talked about something called the illusion of independent agency. And actually, I searched this up on YouTube. There wasn't one fucking video about this on YouTube for some reason. I was really surprised because this study was interesting and I didn't find one video about it. So the illusion of independent agency, and with this study, they surveyed like hundreds of writers and found out that 90% of writers that they surveyed experienced this illusion of independent agency. And basically what this means, this illusion is when a writer experiences their character as having individual thoughts and individual actions. What I mean by this is that it means the writer will experience their character as if their character was an individual autonomous from them, and like they have their own consciousness and they have their own thoughts. What I mean is basically writers can lose control of their characters, bro. I'm not lying. This study showed that a large percentage of writers showed or thought that their characters were like acting by themselves, and they can lose control of their own characters they created in their head. And I'm not making this up. The writers that they surveyed, a lot of them experienced talking with their characters, having conversations with their characters as if they were another person, and they didn't know what they were gonna say next. And some of them experienced feeling their characters in the same room as them. There was one writer who I don't know if this was in the study, but they just used her as an example. There was this famous writer who experienced sleeping with her characters, bro. She said when she was writing her book and she was really deep in like writing it and planning it, she slept with her characters, and sometimes she would get woken up by them. She would get woken up by her characters that she created, and then her characters would ask her about the future, about their future in the book she was writing. There was also another example of a writer who was writing a character and she was planning on making this character get sent to prison and get tortured and beaten up and get like beaten nearly to death. That was the plan for this character in this writer's book. But the writer said the character refused to go along with it. I'm not making this up, bro. I know it sounds crazy, but this is like a real thing that happens to a shit ton of writers. Like, you can read the study if you don't believe me, but this writer said she had to negotiate with this character because he wouldn't go along with being sent to a prison and beat up unless he was given true love at the end of the story. I'm not making that up. So this writer was like, she couldn't write until she negotiated with the character in her head. And there was also another woman, Enid Blyton. I don't know if you know who that is, but Enid Blyton, she's more popular in probably the UK. And I read a lot of her books when I was like a little kid, because she's known for like writing children's book and stuff like that. Children's books, right? And so if you're in the UK, maybe you know who I'm talking about, but so this is a good example because she's like a really famous writer, right? So this happens to a ton of writers. It's not just like a few mentally ill writers or something. This happens to a lot. She was talking about how when she was writing her book, sometimes a character would say a joke that made her laugh out loud as she was writing the joke. And she said there were jokes that her characters said that she couldn't even come up with herself. So her characters were making up their own jokes. And she said she had no idea where they came from. And as I said, in this study, it showed that 90%, I think 92% of the writers they surveyed experiences. This also happened to the woman who wrote Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, I don't know how to fucking pronounce her name, bro. But she said she tried to make Harry Potter a girl. She actually tried to make Harry Potter a girl when she was writing the books, but she said it didn't work because as she started writing it more, Harry, the main character, right, just became so real to her that it would just feel like wrong making him a girl. Like, so isn't that crazy, bro? And this got me thinking about imaginary friends, because if you think about this, the writers experiencing their characters as real, that's kind of like what happens with imaginary friends, right? And the study interestingly said that these writers who experienced this illusion of independent agency were twice as likely to have had an imaginary friend as a kid than like the average population, right? And this is interesting because I actually don't ever remember having an imaginary friend, bro. Let me know if you had an imaginary friend. I never remember having one, but this study mentioned that I think 65% of children under 7 years old have had an imaginary friend. I mean, maybe I had one, but don't remember it. So let me know if you've had one. You'll maybe relate to this stuff I'm talking about more, but so I'm just going, since I didn't have an imaginary friend, I'm just going off what this study talked about. In general, it's actually a thing with children and imaginary friends that they will experience this illusion of independent agency. So if you ever see a kid talking to an imaginary friend, right, they're not necessarily acting like that imaginary friend is acting on their own. Their imaginary friend could actually, to them, be seeming to act by itself. And I'm not making that up. Apparently, it's a very common thing. So I'm not talking about a child acting like their imaginary friend is autonomous and another individual. I'm talking about they found that a lot of children actually, their imaginary friends didn't show up when they wanted them to. Or sometimes they were there when they didn't want them to be there and they followed them around and the child got annoyed. There were other children who talked about their imaginary friend not sharing things with them or talking too loudly and shit like that, bro. It's crazy. Once again, if you had an imaginary friend, tell me if this happened to you. The illusion of independent agency, bro. There was one adult they talked to in this study who had two imaginary friends actually when he was between the ages of 3 and 5. And one of these imaginary friends was kind of like typical child imaginary friend, right? He was kind of controlling him. He was the same as him, basically, kind of just like a similar person. But he said he had another imaginary friend who was superior to him and his other imaginary friend. So he said this other imaginary friend was more intelligent, was more funny, and had more interesting things to say and do. Isn't that crazy, bro? And not only that, he said this imaginary friend sometimes wouldn't even show up. Sometimes he would want to play with this superior imaginary friend, but he wouldn't show up. And he would get sad and he would wonder what that imaginary friend was doing in the day because he just wouldn't show up to play with him, bro. Isn't this fucking crazy? Also, I was thinking, when writers have this with characters, the only reason we're not calling them mentally ill, right, is because we know they're authors. Like, if anyone else had this thing, you would probably call them mentally ill and they would probably be put on like meds or something, but this happens to like 90% of writers. The illusion of independent agency, bro, it's crazy. And so the theory on why this happens, which kind of makes sense. Actually, firstly, since this happens to a lot of writers, a lot of writers hundreds and thousands of years ago always assumed that this kind of stuff was like the gods speaking to them, right? It was like a higher power giving them these ideas that they couldn't think of themselves, and it seemed like another person. A lot of people used to think this was like the gods. But theory now on why this happens is like, think about when you're learning something new or like driving, for example. At first, when you're driving, I don't know if you drive, but like it takes a lot of conscious effort, right? At first you really need to pay attention to what you're doing. But the more you drive or the more you like learn a skill, the easier it gets. And so since it gets easier and easier, over time it kind of seems like you're just doing it automatically. Soon you can do the skill that you learn and like talk to someone else at the same time or kind of multitask, because the task becomes so easy to you that you just do it unconsciously, right? And so this is the theory on why the illusion of independent agency happens. And what it is basically the writer is an expert in fantasy. And so, since they're an expert in fantasy, after a while of creating their character and writing their character, it just becomes like unconscious to them. They're like saying the character words unconsciously. And it becomes so automatic because they're so good at writing that to them, it seems as if the character is acting on their own. Of course, it's still their own brain doing that and creating the character and writing the character's words. But they just become so good at it and so good at writing that, yeah, they just start doing it like unconsciously. And this is also the same with an imaginary friend. When a child experiences the illusion of independent agency, you could say they are also an expert in fantasy and creating fantasy. So I just thought that was interesting as fuck, bro. Oh, I was also reading more about imaginary friends because it was like interesting me. And there was another study on kids ages 12 to 17 that had an imaginary friend. So you're like, when you hear that, you think that's kind of weird because most people stop having an imaginary friend when they're like 5 years old, right? But they talk to kids 12 to 17. So that's like 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds that have an imaginary friend. And surprisingly, and at first they thought maybe there was something wrong with these kids, or there was some kind of like deficit, or they were like had social issues or something like that. But this study surprisingly showed that these kids, these ages with imaginary friends, were actually mostly socially competent and creative kids. So they had no social issues at all. They had like friends, they had like family they talked to. They weren't trying to create an imaginary friend to like replace anyone else or substitute friends and whatever. They were just creating another friend. They already had friends. They didn't have any social issues. They were just creating another imaginary friend. And I thought that was interesting. And that study was like very surprising. Apparently they weren't expecting that at all. You know, I just thought this shit was interesting as hell, bro. And as I said, I never saw a video. I even searched up videos about the illusion of independent agency, and there wasn't one fucking video on it. I have no idea why, because like, how can you say this isn't interesting, bro? So basically, if you're writing a book, be careful, because your characters might start fucking waking you up in the night. They might start sleeping with you and annoying you or following you around. And as I said, let me know if you had an imaginary friend or have an imaginary friend, bro, because I'll actually be interested in that, because I don't remember ever having an imaginary friend in my life. So I'll be interested. And leave me a comment, subscribe if you're not subscribed, that'd be appreciated. But I know you're already subscribed, bro, because you're a G. I know you're already subscribed. And I also have a membership on my channel that gives you absolutely fucking nothing if you want that. And join the Discord in the description as well. Love you.